There is this growing cultural move to separate gender and sex. Instead of your sex being your gender and your gender being sex, now that's been separated. And the new idea is that gender has to do with the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. And then you can break that definition down into two very different categories. The first would be gender roles, which describe the social and cultural aspects of being male or female. In other words, all things related to masculinity and femininity. And that's largely built around stereotypes, men liking blue and women liking pink and that kind of thing. But then there is gender identity. And gender identity has to do with the psychological aspects associated with being male or female. Someone's internal sense of self as male, female, both, or neither, which does bring up the transgender issue. The word transgender has become something of an umbrella term for the various ways some people experience incongruence between their biological sex and what is now being called gender. And that is either, the incongruity can be either with a gender role or gender identity. And from that incongruence has come the idea that people should therefore feel free to choose their gender despite their biological sex. The heart of the transgender argument is that sex and gender are two different concepts. Sex may be biological, but gender is not. It's cultural, something imposed, learned, personally decided upon. This suggests that gender is distinct from the nature of sexuality, so sex becomes a role we take on as opposed to the nature of our being. We can disregard the biology, which is an obvious tension with not only science, but Scripture. The Bible maintains that we are created male and female. That was God's plan. That was God's intent. Being male and female is rooted in biology. It is not something plastic or on some kind of spectrum to be determined by us or based on gender identity or gender role. We are a race of male and females, and that is rooted in how we were made. So that brings up the tension point and the question. If someone experiences incongruence between their biological self and their sex and their internal sense of self, which one determines who they are? Science would say, well, it's their biological sex. Scripture would say it's their biological sex. Culture is increasingly saying, no, it's gender. So on that front, the disagreement is both simple but profound. What complicates this is what is known as gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a psychological term for the distress that some people feel when their internal sense of self does not match up to their biological sex. So I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about it in regard to these two major ideas, gender role and gender identity. Let's start off with gender role. Let me tell you about a guy by the name of KD. He grew up as the youngest of several brothers in a context where men were expected to be masculine and women feminine. Real men served in the military. Women typically stayed home and had babies. KD's brothers naturally joined the military and went off to war. KD, on the other hand, decided to stay home and write poetry. Like many poets, KD also had a talent for writing and playing music. So while his brothers were off at war, he stayed home and wrote poetry and wrote music and sang songs about nature and beauty and his emotions and God and his best friend, John. John and KD were inseparable. They spent tons of time together and desperately missed each other when they were apart. KD vowed that he would spend the rest of his life with John, that they would never break this friendship, and John felt the same. They were not sexual with each other. This was not a homosexual relationship at all, but they were more than your typical American male friends. When they were together, they would laugh, they would cry, they would talk, they would hug. Sometimes they would even kiss each other on the cheek in a friendship sort of way, as people in Russia and other countries still do to this day. A few years later, John enlisted in the military and went to war. He rose through the ranks. He was a very skilled fighter, and one day John was killed in battle. When the news reached KD's ears, he was devastated and he fell into a depression. He refused to eat. He wept profusely. Then he took up his pen and poured out his heart in a poem, describing John's love as better than the love he felt toward women. After KD's own death, the poem would be published and read by millions. So moving, so intimate, so loving were the words of that poem that some people to this day believe that KD and John had to have been gay, even though they weren't. They just didn't fit stereotypes of both masculinity as well as male brotherhood and friendship. And just in case you haven't caught on by now, the story I'm telling you of KD is in the Bible. KD stands for King David. In the Bible, you find men often kissing other men, crying, they're being tender, profoundly emotional, relational. You have women described as entrepreneurs and running a business, wise, hardworking, strong arms, and engaging in social justice. Fortune 500 companies, for example, would kill for a CEO as qualified as the woman described in Proverbs 31. But you also find the traditional stereotypes of masculinity and femininity portrayed in its pages, which is why you'll never find a single biblical command for a man to act masculine or a woman to act feminine. They're just commanded to be godly, which is why perceived dysphoria with gender roles, to my thinking, is just not a big deal. And it's not something that if you feel it, I would say to you, I wouldn't consider it a big deal. You should not consider it a big deal. Gender roles are largely stereotypes and have changed throughout history. As I mentioned last week, pink used to be a masculine color. Now it isn't. But see, that's a cultural stereotype. So if a woman doesn't identify with certain roles associated with femininity, she doesn't like dresses, she's drawn to engineering, she's a football fanatic, that shouldn't cause her or anyone else any concern. She also shouldn't question whether she actually is a female, and no one else should either. We shouldn't impose cultural stereotypes of what it means to be male or female onto anyone. Now, we did learn last week that we shouldn't put ourselves forward culturally as men or women in ways that clearly signal to the world that we are denying, even repudiating our biological sex. But beyond that, gender roles are simply not the issue. That's not the case when it comes to gender identity. Where there is true gender dysphoria, someone really does look in the mirror and see a man's body that they simply don't identify with, or a woman's body that they just don't identify with. In 1980, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders of the American Psychiatric Association called this transsexualism, and they listed it as a mental disorder. That entry was later replaced by what psychiatrists called gender identity disorder. And then in 2013, it was later modified to simply gender dysphoria, which is discomfort with the gender a person is living in. Now, that's quite a progression in looking at things over just 3 decades, but it's a sign of how culture has shifted dramatically to seeing it as something to be treated, cured, as opposed to now something to be affirmed and enabled. So how many transgender people are there? Not many. Right at around 0.5% of the population. But if you're in that category, the small size of co-sympathizers doesn't matter. It's very real to you. And if that's you or someone you know, let me say, again, that no matter how you may have responded to that dysphoria to this point, dressing opposite your biological sex, even transitioning through hormones and operations in a way that has attempted to change your biological sex, God so loves you and cares about you, and so do I. I said that to you last week. I wanted to say it again. You so matter to God, and you matter to me. And I can't speak for all churches, but I can speak for this one. You matter to this church. What you're feeling is real, just like what a gay person feels. And by the way, not everyone who is trans is gay, but let me draw the correlation to that, that just like a gay person, their orientation is real. They didn't choose it. It's the same with someone experiencing gender dysphoria. So if you were to tell me you're gay or you're trans, I mean, I don't even bat an eye. It's like, okay, you might as well have just told me any number of things that, what I want to know and I would like to talk about is how you're going to live in light of that orientation. How are you going to live in light of that dysphoria? Is it going to honor Christ or dishonor Christ? That's the question. Nobody denies the dysphoria. Nobody denies the orientation. Because the reason I asked the question about, though, how you're going to live in light of it is because while there's acceptance of you as a person and the very real challenges that you face, that does not mean that there's a blanket affirmation of the various ways that you can respond to your orientation or respond to your dysphoria. The Bible never condemns homosexuals. Did you know that? Only homosexual activity and behavior. The Bible never condemns trans people, only those who choose to live in denial of their biological sex. Here's what Jesus wants for all of us. He wants to heal anything and everything that is broken. And we're all sexually broken in one way or another, and we all need Christ brought to bear on that brokenness. We're all spiritually disabled and have aspects of our life that are not as they were meant to be. If you have true gender dysphoria, you didn't choose it. Again, you're spiritually disabled in that area, just like I'm spiritually disabled in areas. That's not the way it's supposed to be, but you're not culpable for your condition. Having dysphoria is not a moral issue. But while gender dysphoria is a real psychological condition which causes someone to think and feel like a different sex, it doesn't mean that you are a different sex. Our brokenness isn't immoral, but there are moral choices that can flow in terms of how we respond to our brokenness. Christ's call in your life is to get the help you need to manage your gender dysphoria in light of a relationship with Christ, and to surround yourself with people who will serve you to help you live in accordance with your biological sex. In a healthy psychology, there is unity between your biological sex and your sense of self. Jesus wants to bring you to that unity. And it doesn't come from changing or denying your biology, but working on what's going on in here and in here. And even if there never is that full union this side of heaven, the goal is for you to live in submission to how God made you. And how he made you is hardwired into your biology, not your psyche. So when it comes to living out a trans life in terms of dressing opposite your biological sex or medically transitioning to the opposite of your biological sex, Jesus would say, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. Instead, he would invite you on the journey toward living in acceptance of your biological sex. The call of Christ is oriented toward living out the divine image that God created you to be. Sexed bodies are part of that image. Transitioning would be moving you further away from who you are, not bringing you closer to it. And it's not the key to solving whatever, the stuff in your head or the depression or the dysphoria. In fact, did you know that studies show that people who medically transition have higher risk, considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the rest of the population. The mental health risks of trans people after surgery are considerably higher than those of non-trans people. In other words, transitioning didn't solve anything because you weren't addressing the real dysphoria. If you come to Christ and you enter into Christian community, the goal is to return you to God's creational intent, to help you find congruence of gender identity with biological sex, to accept your sexed body as part of your God-given identity. I know that's going to take a journey, but it's the journey you're called to begin. Now, I know that many of you non-trans folk are wondering about the many real cultural issues that we're facing in relation to those who have embraced a trans identity and who are calling for full social inclusion as that trans identity. Men who are living and dressing like women or have medically transitioned to female features and anatomy through surgery and hormones, they want full affirmation of their chosen gender, as in bathrooms, sports, prison assignments, and more. And friends, this is tricky. Feminists are concerned that the rights they've worked so hard to secure for women will be eroded through the idea of what it means to be a biological woman disavowed. There's a strong case to be made that current transgender ideology, in terms of the ones that want to affirm and embrace and enable it, will hurt women who have fought hard for sex-based legal protections, female-only spaces that was deemed necessary due to the pervasive threat of male violence and sexual assault, like locker rooms, like bathrooms. It's also argued that the different reproductive roles of males and females required laws to safeguard women from discrimination in the workplace and elsewhere, for example, when they would give birth to a baby. The idea that sex is rooted in subjective identity instead of objective biology renders all of these sex-based rights impossible to enforce. Separate sporting categories, it is argued, are necessary to ensure that women and girls don't have to face competitors who have acquired the irreversible performance-enhancing effects conferred by male puberty. And when those lines aren't followed, the results can be disturbing. And I know that the argument against that is, well, it hasn't really happened, it's not that big a deal. But when it has happened, it's been a big deal. For example, the case of the trans MMA fighter, someone who had transitioned from male to female, who wanted to fight against women as an MMA fighter. It was allowed, and they fractured the skull of their opponent. She received 7 staples in her head, suffered a concussion, had the orbital bone inside her head fractured, and this is how the female opponent described the event. I fought a lot of women, and I've never felt the strength that I felt in a fight as I did that night. I can't answer whether it's because she was born a man or not, because I'm not a doctor. I can only say I've never felt so overpowered ever in my life, and I'm an abnormally strong female in my own right. Their grip was different. I could usually move around in the clinch against other females, but I couldn't move at all in their clinch. And then there's what's happening in, for example, in Canada with prison system. In Canada, if you say you're a male, you're a male. You're treated that way. If you want to say I'm a female today, you're treated as a female. That's Canadian law. And you have to be treated accordingly. Well, that's just created a bit of a problem because a lot of prisoners have said, oh, I want to be over in a women's prison. I'm a woman. And they're having to move these men into women's prisons. And these were individuals incarcerated for rape and sexual violence against women. So we really do have some cultural issues related to this. And let's just be candid. With all the love we want to express, we also need to say, listen, many of these cultural issues will put Christians at odds against some within the trans community. Because when it moves beyond relational acceptance and enters the world of affirmation or enablement, we must be true to our Christian and biblical convictions. But that has nothing to do with our ongoing call to love. And that love is so needed. According to a study of over 6,000 trans adults, 57% have family members who refuse to speak to them. 50% have experienced harassment at school. 65% have suffered physical or sexual violence. 69% have experienced homelessness. We can do better. We need to do better. And when we do better, it makes a difference. One last story. Alan grew up as a pastor's kid, but he could not wait to leave the church after he graduated high school. For as long as he could remember, Alan had an unchosen desire to dress, act, behave like a woman. He had no one to talk to, no one to guide him, and seeing the church's attitude toward LGBTQ people made him feel even more isolated and ashamed. He also grew tired of the hypocrisy in the church, talking up grace but not putting it into practice. So after high school, Alan left the church, but he couldn't get away from Christians. They kept popping up. One day, a Christian friend asked to hear Alan's story, so Alan told him everything. His desire to be a woman, his sexual attraction to men, his failures in trying to follow his own convictions about sexual ethics. Alan expected to be condemned. To his surprise, he was loved. Instead of the shaming and condemnation he expected, he was told that despite his past and present desires, God didn't hate him. He was lovable by others and by God. Those simple words pierced his soul. And Alan gave his life to Christ, all because he had the courage to share a story with a Christian friend who received him graciously. Reflecting on it, here's what Alan had to say. He said, if I had never learned about pure, undistilled grace, I would have transitioned to a female and left the church. The thing that brought me to an acceptance of biblical masculinity was not a poignantly laid out exegetical argument against transsexuality, nor a fire and brimstone diatribe against homosexuality, but a man who gave me the space to speak about my desires openly and let me know he and God loved me nonetheless. And if nothing else, that is what I hope you heard and felt today. You matter to God. You matter to me. You matter to this church. You are and always will be loved. Jesus wants to meet you where you are. Begin where you are and journey with you to health and wholeness.